Hello. Last year, in this same room with Kevin, I don't know if he's here somewhere, we released API Platform 3. Now, we won't release the version 3.2 today, but I will speak a little bit about the release cycle of API Platform. So since version 3, we choose to release a minor version every 6 months and to release a major version every 2 years. Since last year, we released the version 3.1, and yesterday we actually released the 3.2 in a beta version. Between the 3.0 and 3.1, you can see that there were about 250 commits, and it was about the same thing between the 3.1 and 3.2. This is about 2.5 commits a day, which is quite nice, and this also shows you that the project is maintained and on a daily basis, right? This was done by about 65 contributors, me and Kevin included. So thanks very much to all these contributors to have this happened. Hopefully, this will be my last word about the 2.7 version. So rest in peace 2.7. We still added a new, we merged a few patches on it, especially for the upgrade path. People improved the upgrade script we were providing, and there is still something to be done there. But as you can see, the GitHub action is quite red on it, and it's really, really hard to maintain. Now, if you want, say, for example, create a script that migrates YAML configuration from 2.7 to 3.0, I would obviously merge it, right? But I will not write it, or you need to give me time and money, actually. Maintenance is hard. If you have issues upgrading, please contact Letiel. We can help you. We did it on many, many projects, and we are quite good at it because we know this software by heart. By the way, tomorrow at 2 o'clock, there will be a talk from Bastien talking about a migration from 2.x to the 3 version. And he was actually using YAML files. Now I will present you the few features we had this year, starting with the 3.0 version that you probably all know about, where we introduced metadata refactoring, so with these new attributes, state providers and processors, the concept of URI variables, and altogether, what most of the users now tell is that API platform is easier to get around, more intuitive and less restrictive. And so thank you very much to everyone that said that to me. It means a lot, actually, because you know it's been a lot of work, but we see also that there were results and that you're having a good time now using API platform. The software is way more permissive than before. And you will see that it gets only better. Now, what was brought with the 3.1 version? First, we introduced the standard put option. So actually, since API platform started, the put method was kind of wrong according to the HTTP specification, and you know we like specifications. It was doing a partial update, whereas put should actually just replace the content. Now, if you enable the standard put option inside the extra properties, you will get this replacement. And this will be the default in the version 4. So you should put it in your resources or it may break. We also introduced the allow create option that allows you to just use put as you would use post to create a new resource. To do partial updates, just use the patch method with the merge patch specification. A quick reminder, it doesn't update collections that are embedded in your resources, so don't open another issue for that. There is no point. The specification says it like that. We can't do anything. We also introduced this collect denormalization error. So this is tied to a Symfony update that now allows to collect every errors there are when denormalizing your body. And this is an example of a response you would get. For example, we sent the wrong types, and you will get each error. This is quite good for development, but beware in production. It's a potential vector of attack because it would require much work on the server. About OpenAPI, it's now possible to give a Boolean to OpenAPI to just disable this operation inside your documentation. We deprecated the OpenAPI context, which was an array, in favor of an object. I will show that to you in a second. And we finally have Swagger UI version 5, which supports OpenAPI 3.1. So I'm really excited about that. How to customize OpenAPI? So the OpenAPI factory still works. You can still decorate it. But if you want, you can also use our models directly inside the attribute like this. For example, I specified here a new different request body that supports form data. Note that since 3.1, this component is now available as a standalone component. You can just install API platform/OpenAPI, and you will get only that part of API platform, and you will not get all the rest of the code. About that, we splitted most of the API platform components, so you have a list on, it's non-exhaustive, but it's a start. And you have all these components that you can use without the rest of API platform if you want to. Maybe that this will help us build API platform for other frameworks in the future. One last big update we introduced was this state options option inside resources, which helps giving a bunch of options to ODM, Elasticsearch, ORM, etc. Here, I'm just saying, yeah, I have this book, which is a resource, but the entity, the doctrine entity, which is tied to that, is in another namespace, and please, API platform, use this entity to get my data. So it's automatic. If you want to know more about these kind of things, I invite you to take a look at Ryan's talk tomorrow. He will talk about a DTO system of your dreams using this option. In the 3.1 version, we introduced way more features, a new agnostic cache purger, enum support on OpenAPI, JSON schema, etc. And as I just said, many components are available now in standalone. Now, let's take a look to this new version 3.2 that was released yesterday. We finally have write support on alternate resources or sub-resources. This is quite nice. This is something we want to have since ages now. And all you have to do is add this create provider on your resource. On top of that, you can also customize what IREs are going to be used in your response. For example, if you have a collection but you don't want to have the automatic IREs, you can just pick one of your defined resources. This looks a bit complicated. today at 5 o'clock, Matthias will present you these features and explain to you how it works. So I invite you to also take a look at this to know more about this new sub-resource system. You remind yourself that we introduced URI variables in the API Platform 3 version. And this is a simple example where I have a book/title, and my title is actually an identifier. Now, with that, we introduced this new feature because there was missing an extension point in API Platform where all these links are handled. So by default, we inside the API Platform providers for Doctrine or whatever, we read all your links and try to do the joins, the wheres, etc., etc. So if you wanted to hook into that, you had to create a new provider or extend hours, and it was duplicating some code. So what we did here, we introduced this handle link option, and you can hook there, get the query builder, some identifiers, and just build the workflows, add SQL or whatever. Note that here I use a function, but you can also use a Symfony service. This is something I'm the most proud of, and it was also contributed with people at L'Etiel, and was quite hard to put into place. And what we saw is that Hydra, the Hydra specification, now wants to be compatible with the JSON problem specification. And they want their errors to be compliant with this specification. And so we upgraded our code to match this. And also, we introduced errors as resources. Now, an exception can be a resource inside API Platform. And you can specify on this resource whatever status code you want, whatever IRE or messages, etc. And there is a new interface, which is the problem exception interface, that allows you to match the JSON problem specification, because there are fields you need to add. So this is really quite nice to avoid using exception to status or to do more business-driven exceptions. Now, I will leave you with that weird picture for a moment. It was generated by an AI, I guess. I don't think it exists. Well, I presented you many of the new features of API Platform 3.2 and 3.1. And now let's go into the good stuff. But let's take a quick back in time to this initial commit by Kevin, which was dated in 2015. So 8 years ago, this was API Platform. It was a controller with some action, getting the data and returning a JSON LD response. This was quite nice, but it wasn't extendable. And then he introduced an ADR implementation with more decoupling, content negotiation. And to do that, he used event listeners inside Symfony. So he used kernel event listeners. Who knows since when this Webby exists? Yes, obviously, you know. The Webby was first designed in 2015 when the Dunkless API bundle was renamed API Platform. So it's also quite old now. When API Platform, I was digging a bit into the commits, and I found this comment of mine for the API Platform 2 release, and I was really excited in 2016 with this new version. So I'm quite excited with API Platform 3 today, so it made me laugh a bit. Let's go back to complicated stuff. Have you already seen this schema? Yeah? This is from the Symfony documentation and shows you how HTTP kernel listeners work. And what will be interesting here are the number 1, which is request, and the number 6, which is view. These are the part of the kernel where we hook API platform, basically, just before and after calling the controller, which is number 5. And if we take a look at the code, and I don't know if you saw Alexander's conference this morning, he was recreating an API without API platform, creating event listeners, and actually he kind of created that 4 years ago. But this is how API platform works. We take this patch HTTP request that you can see, and before the controller, it will try to fetch the data. So here it's the first book. It will probably call the security, have you the right to update it or not, deserialize title API platform to an object. Then it will call a controller, but right now in API platform, the controller does nothing. And then we'll give this to the view, where we validate the data, put it inside your database, so we update the title here, and give you back an answer, which is a response in JSON LD or JSON API, etc. But why are listeners not ideal? First, there is a strong link with Symfony HTTP kernel, but that's all right. Listeners' priorities are not covered by the BC layer. I don't know if it happens to you, but sometimes in Symfony they want to move a listener, and then if you relied on the order of the calls, then you can do much about it. Your code breaks. It's quite hard to share the logic between systems inside API platforms. For example, we have the GraphQL subsystem, which is also relying on the same security, validation, etc. But we are duplicating the code everywhere because we cannot call kernel listeners from GraphQL. And since the beginning since API Platform 2, actually, in the documentation, it's written that it's discouraged to use event listeners. But what did we introduce in API Platform 3, which was quite great? Providers and processors. So I thought, why not go back to this controller we had 8 years ago, let's call it a main controller, where we have a provider and a processor, and we call the provider to get the data, etc., what we were doing before inside the request hook, and then call the processors. If you take this ID and go back to these listeners we saw earlier, we see that a read listener can be a read provider, which is itself called by a security provider, which is itself called by a deserialized provider. This is actually a decoration pattern, if we want to go in depth. And we can do the exact same thing for the listeners on the view event. Now, why is this good? First, we can share the logic. Here we have this state provider access checker. So this is where API platform hooks the security, checks what you configured, and whether the user is allowed to write the resource or whatever. And now this service can be shared between GraphQL and HTTP. And on top of that, if we want to hook the security before reading the data, we can. And then if we want to hook the security after reading the data, for example, if we need to know who the owner of the book is, so we need to fetch the data. And so this service needs to be called at many, many points. Previously, we relied on priorities, and we had issues in the past with Symfony breaking this. So now, because it's just decorating the correct provider in the chain, we won't have any issues. And this is also really good for you, because now if you want to hook into some API platform layer, instead of creating a provider, you could just decorate whatever you want, and you will be sure to be always at the same spot. If you want to enable that, there is a flag, a compatibility flag, event listeners backward compatibility layer. Note that we are not sure yet whether it will be, whether we will remove event listeners or not. We need to have you test this for us and let us know if, for what did you rely on event listeners, for what use cases, is it hard to upgrade, etc. So please give us feedbacks on the GitHub issue and tell us what you think. Note that inside, I don't know if you guys opened the API platform source code, but we rely a lot on request attributes. We still rely on request attributes. This hasn't changed. So if you read something from that, there is no issue. Anyways, don't rely on our listeners to change API platform behavior. And if you need to alter API platform, try to decorate our providers and processors. And the last thing is that if you wanted, you could create your own controller, which I showed earlier, picking only the bits you want. For example, if you want only serialization and you want to use your own stuff for validation, it would be also possible. Right. And inside API Platform 3.2, on top of that, we replaced the doctrine inflector. So this is what pluralized your URIs, for example, book to books, etc. We replaced it with Symfony string. I strongly advise to try this flag because it can break. And the best thing you can do here is to use your own logic to pluralize stuff. We now support union and intersect types. This was really requested since PHP 8 that introduced that. And we have Elasticsearch 8 compatibility and way more stuff that you can find inside the release notes. So, I'm getting to my last part of this talk, which will be the most interesting one, I hope, which is the documentation revolution. So to me, in this talk, there are many revolutions in many ways, but this one took quite some work. And first, we have a new website. So a big applause to Laurie and Cecile for providing that. Thank you very much for the design. It's online for quite some time, but yeah, we didn't quite communicate on it yet. And you know, inside open source software, there is a big issue, which is documentation. Thank you. Why? Because we are, I am a lazy developer. Probably you are not, but I'm lazy. I'm a developer. I would have done something else as a job if I wasn't lazy. And actually, when I write a new feature, and I think if you work on open source software, you often just write the feature and then forget that you have to do the documentation pull request anyways. Who's going to use that? Documentation is a hard problem. Actually, the guy from Diataxis discovered this website is really great. He tries to build some kind of framework behind documentation to try to see how it can be done in a good way. And when I read this, I was like, yeah, but can't we use code as documentation? So I know that myself, when I use Symfony or API platform, I read the code. When something doesn't work, I go check, okay, it's doing that. And so I tried. I took a simple use case that you have here, which is a simple declaration of a book resource with some operation on it. And I added a few comments. And this is really close to literate programming, which is a technique used to describe exactly what the code does. And if we take these comments and put them on the left side and take the code on the right side, it gives you this kind of output, which is quite nice to just read and understand what's going on inside the code. But now this is a PHP file, right? So I can execute it. So why not add tests? And yeah, because if we test the documentation will always be up to date with our code, right? So this is so nice. A guide is an executable, I'm introducing actually guides. It's an executable PHP file that can be tested and run with PHP unit. You think I'm done? I'm not done. I'm experiencing with WebAssembly for quite some time now. I did this conference at a few meetups and stuff. I can also give it at your place, just invite me. It would be my pleasure. And I really wanted to find a way to run this PHP documentation live in your browser so that new users could have access to this without installing anything. And yeah, let's take a look at that. So I need to remove this, go there, probably full screen. This is the beautiful new website, documentation. The first thing I want to show you, because documentation from the code can be way more than just what I just showed. We introduced this API reference where you would find all the classes, and so it's an ongoing process, right? It's not done, but we are adding lots of comments everywhere in our code so that you can get more data about what's available, for example, inside an API resource. So if I go down, this is supporting Markdown. So there are comments inside the PHP file now with Markdown, trying to explain giving you examples. And we even have YAML and XML examples. And this comes from the code, right? So if you see something here that's wrong or whatever, just please send us a patch. It's really easy. It's only commenting, so it's no logic involved. Now, let's take a look at these guides. So let's take this one, for example. You see that this is a guide showing you how to create a provider and actually adding data and sending data to your response. You see on the top right, there is a Run Live button. Let's try this. Here, now we have the API Platform Playground. On the left side, it's editable code, and on the right side, you see that we have an JSON response. If I go in this example here, the guide says, you can try to add a new book to your collection. Let's try it. I can't see anything. Oh, okay. Did a mistake. And now I have to add it here as well. So it doesn't support LSP right now, PHP LSP, but I really want to add it at some point. Did I miss a character, or it's fine like this? Like this? Perfect. So what you see on the response is actually as a request that is sent to Symfony, and everything is running in the browser in WebAssembly, so there is a PHP binary there, which is executing code and just giving you the output of the request. And I added a small Easter egg here, because new beginners quite like the Swagger UI. It's it's friendly to use. I don't like it. I prefer curl, but when I execute a request on the Swagger UI, it's exactly the same thing. We send a request inside the PHP WebAssembly stuff, and yeah, I can show you that I don't lie, because inside the networks, when I execute something, nothing is happening, right? And I did not fork Chrome to do this demo. So yeah. Let's go back to the presentation. Oops. So what's up next? If you follow me on Twitter or the internet, the World Wide Web, you saw that I sent a talk to the forum PHP that got accepted, which is how we made API platform compatible with Laravel. So yeah, we will see how this works. Be ready for API Platform 4. There is a command that was contributed not long ago, which is Composer recipe updates, which will add all the backward compatibility flag I just talked about, so that you're up and ready for API Platform 4. Now, for the rest, follow me on social media if you want to know more about what's coming up next. And I really thank you all for coming to this conference, which is quite a big deal for us. And I hope that you liked my black magic. Thank you.